So we begin Unit 12, government spending lesson, by looking at the growth and function of government. So in this lesson, we're going to look at how the government has grown over time, particularly within this last 100 years. And then we'll look at the primary functions of government to see and examine exactly what role the government should play within our economy. So one of the seemingly inevitable things with government is that it grows over time. So over the last 85 years, the federal, state, and local governments in the United States have all grown considerably. And there's three reasons for this growth, and these aren't like general reasons. These are specific events within the United States that give us an idea of why government spending was increasing. So the first of these is the New Deal program. Then we look at the Cold War, and then the move to fiat money in 1971, which we've already discussed. So this one will be rehashed and make sure we get the general ideas of what's going on. Okay, so let's start by looking at this New Deal program. So our New Deal program was designed to do two things. The first was to solve the immediate problems of the Great Depression. One of the first and most significant here was job loss when the market crashed. What we saw was these companies all of a sudden were losing significant amount of financial capital. So how do they respond to that? They start to remove employees. At the same time, though, when we look at how the economy crashed, you'll get an idea really quickly of why there was so much significant job loss. So when you look at the unemployment rates, you'll notice that beginning in 1929, we see unemployment rising until it reaches a peak in 33, and then begins to drop again through 37, and then it jumps again in 38. And you also notice, of course, at that height there in 1933 compared to 1929. So in 1929, you get the idea there. You see just how many people were unemployed, how much that changed from 1929 to 1933. So in 4 years, there was a significant amount of job loss within the American economy. There was also a decline in real GDP. So to give you an idea of how this really looked, if you're looking at it from a graphic perspective, from aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply, what happened was that in 1929, 1930, what we saw is a shift to the left in aggregate demand. So when that shift occurred and aggregate demand fell quite considerably, you'll see what happened. Price levels plummet, so that's deflating. We have a deflating currency. And that also, of course, causes spending to dry up. And when that happens, firms begin to fire employees. And so you can see that not only was there a significant drop in price level, there was also a significant drop in real GDP. And so that is what took place when the Depression hit. And then the goal of the government, of course, is to try to find a way to correct this and get this economy restarted. So when we look at real GDP, you'll notice here, you can see the dip in real GDP. Now, when we look at our economy, we don't see dips in the long run trend very often, obviously. But you can see, I mean, that's a fairly significant dip when you look at what's happening within the economy. And then you'll notice it starts to rise again and then dips and then rises again. So you can see really when you're talking about the New Deal, you're talking about two separate incidences in which we see economic collapse. One is in 1929, which by 1932 we start to see some recovery. And then again here in 1935, 36, we begin to see again the economy depresses. So we see that recession. So here's that business cycle that you can see. There's also a loss in financial capital. Basically what was happening was there was a lot of speculation within the stock market. If you go back and look at U.S. history and look at the panics were on average around 20 years or so. In almost every single instance of those panics, there was speculation of some good within the market. For the longest time, it was land speculation. Right around the turn of the 20th century, you saw speculation in the gold market. Here you've got speculation in the stock market. In 2008, you had speculation on the housing market. You remember all those shows about flipping houses? Well, that was a part of this. And the concept here with speculation is individuals were borrowing money from these banks. They were investing it into the stock market, all of these stocks which were shooting up in price, and then they would sell that stock and pay off the loan and make a profit. Well, the problem is the banks were readily handing out all of this money available for loans to individuals to do this, and when the market collapsed, all of a sudden you had all of these people who couldn't pay off these loans. Other individuals who had savings accounts in the banks, they began rushing to the banks to get in line to withdraw their money, and once all the money had been withdrawn, the banks just closed. That was it. And this was happening on average is you literally had one bank a day that was closing all over the United States. You had all of these banks that were closing, and you had all this financial capital was basically just disappearing on individuals. And when that happened, of course, you see that there's a steep decline in spending. And we look at falling price levels. If you look at CPI, you can see here how price levels fell. They were very much leveling off in the late 1920s, and then you just see that 1929 into 1930, going into 1931, that just drop in prices, so that deflation within the currency, which creates rising unemployment. So when we look at that inflation rate, it's clear there, you see how much it drops. I mean, we're talking about an inflation rate that reaches minus 10%. So prices fell by 10%, which that's significant. And then you see that sharp rise there in 1932, and that represents the New Deal program. So you'll get an idea real quick of how the New Deal attempted to solve our short-term problems. In addition was the development of long-term solutions to prevent future collapse. Banking reforms were instituted in which more control was taken in terms of what money was being loaned out. Banks were forced to close for a number of days until they were able to shore up their deposits, and then they would be able to reopen and start dealing with customers again. And banking after this took a significant hit because it took a long time for individuals to become comfortable with putting their money back in the banks. And one of the things we know about putting money into banks is if we don't have that money into savings, then that doesn't allow us to have financial capital from which to borrow from. So one of Roosevelt's major solutions here was you had to get money into the banks. And the only way you could do that was to ensure the health of the banking system so that people would put money in, which could then be pulled out through loans and used to invest in expansion of industries. There was also oversight of the stock exchange, in part to prevent the speculation within the market, but also to prevent the fact that real prices and nominal prices of stocks were significantly different. The real price of stocks was much lower than the value that was being shown within the market. So when the market crashed, you get the idea, it crashed all the way back to the real price and then went further. So there was a significant decline in the stock market because of that gap that had been created between real and the nominal prices of stocks. Medical programs were put in place to help the elderly, low-income families to pay for medical care. Social Security was put in place. Social Security was basically, from a realistic standpoint, Social Security was designed to put money away so that individuals could retire. What Roosevelt wanted to do was to get an awful lot of older individuals out of the job market because those were the highest paid. So if you get those long-term employees, you get them out of the job market, then you bring in new individuals who are being paid less money, but you also, now you get those individuals in there working while you're helping to pay for older individuals and move them out of the economy. That's what Social Security was designed to do. Also unemployment insurance, and it was a temporary basis so that when people did lose their jobs for a temporary time, they would receive money from the government until they could get back on their feet and then get another job. So when we look at how this New Deal program was developed, and we see that minimum wage was also during this time, we get a very clear idea that it's during the New Deal that America begins to create its welfare program. And Roosevelt's responsible with Congress and with his different individuals that he worked with to create this welfare state in order to take care of the people. So one of the features we see of government then is the government's going to be responsible for promoting general health and for taking care of people. So solving the immediate problems of the Great Depression required that the government to shift aggregate demand back to the right, because remember, we had a significant fall to the left. And so the first thing they did is they moved the country off the gold standard. Remember, the representative system within gold is that you could only produce the amount of money equal to the amount of gold you held in reserve. So that the dollar amounts in the market, the banknotes, they equaled up the amount of gold, and there was a limit at which that could allow money to be printed. By moving the country off the gold standard, you eliminated that currency backing of gold and said, okay, we're going to be able to print as much money as we want. So it increased the money supply. So obviously right away, Roosevelt's attempt to restart the economy and to shift aggregate demand to the right was creating an increase in the money supply? Was to inflate the currency. Of course, that brings up two principles. Number one, of course, would be Phillips curve. What's an inflation in the economy going to do? And number two is it's a pretty standard thing that we see, because remember, the Federal Reserve, in order to increase the money supply, they basically will change the interest rates. So they'll lower the interest rates to encourage people to borrow more money. So this created an increasing price level. So as prices increase with these prices, remember we talked about this sticky prices, the sticky wage theory. So price levels are increasing, but prices themselves are taking time. And so in that gap that develops between increased price levels and actual prices, we see people spending money. And when people are spending money, of course, that forces the firms to have to produce more goods, thus hiring more employees with their variable cost. Now, the thing about it is, though, is that there just weren't jobs to be had. So in addition to increasing the money supply and creating inflation by taking us off the gold standard, Roosevelt had to create jobs as well. So this would reduce unemployment. So in other words, during the New Deal program, the government became one of the primary sources of generating employment. They used what was called the Civilian Conservation Corps to bring in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young men and put them through this program in which they would feed them and house them so that all their wages could be sent home. And they built all kinds of things for the government, roads and all these different things they did. Now, create long-term solutions to prevent future collapse. When we look at federal government spending, we see this significant increase. If you look at 1930 to 1940, that's still going from 5% up over 10%. Now, obviously, that huge, massive jump there between the 1940s is World War II. But one of the things you'll notice, of course, is since the Great Depression, there's been a consistent increase in federal spending. Now, in the 1990s, under the Clinton administration, there was a decrease in spending. But then, of course, you look at 2000 and since, there's been a significant increase in government spending over time. So one of the things that we notice, of course, is government's primary solution to dealing with the recession is to throw money at it, is to increase price levels, to create inflation. Why? Because of the concepts of Phillips curve. So when we look at national debt as a percentage of GNP, remember GNP was the primary measurement in the United States until early 1980s when we switched over to GDP. So you'll notice there you see that significant rise from 1920 into 31, and then of course peaking at 33 and leveling out, and then jumping again there right before World War II, and then ultimately jumping very significant during World War II. So one of the creations immediately and long-term solutions in preventing future collapses was an increase within the money supply. So you had all of these creation of programs. Remember the fact that you had to have Social Security, you had minimum wage, you had unemployment, you had medical care. All of these are programs that are being created. Now the thing about it is you had to have a department to run each program. So not only was government spending increasing as a result of trying to restart the economy, but under the New Deal, the government itself became much, much larger because it had all of these different departments to run all of these different programs. And you had employees working in these different departments. So you can see how spending is going to occur. We're creating departments, we got to hire employees, so the government is getting larger. What we call the bureaucracy was getting bigger. And this wasn't just on a national level, but it was also on a state and a local level as well. So you had all these departments and employees at the state and local level, which were being created to administer programs within the New Deal as well. Because New Deal programs essentially worked out in one of two ways. Either the money went straight from the government into the hands of the people in terms of how it was filtering things, or it would go into the states, and then the states were responsible for doling it out through the departments and employees there. So it results in a significantly larger bureaucracy. And that's one of the things about the government is every time the government creates these new programs, you have these new departments coming online in which to administer these programs. So over time, we've seen a significant growth, not only in government spending, but also in literally the size of the government itself and the number of employees. Now, a second aspect of the 20th century, which created a significant increase in government spending and size of government, was the Cold War. It lasted from the end of World War II in 1945 up until 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. You saw a significant growth in government spending during the Cold War. When you look there, of course, you see that growth during World War II, of course, and then you see the decline, obviously. But if you look at where we were in 1950 compared to 1939, And then look at 1950 going into 1990, you see this fairly significant rise in federal spending, and a part of that was spending on military. Particularly in the 1945 through the 1960s, that's the time period when the United States and the Russians were really pushing nuclear missile development. And so as they were not only building and creating new and more destructive bombs, you had the hydrogen bomb, that they also saw an increase in how they were delivering in terms of missiles, space programs. You had all of these things related to the 1945 through the 60s in terms of growth. So you see a significant increase in military spending during that time. You have a national defense budget that increased significantly. You had conventional and non-conventional warfare being created. Conventional warfare, tanks, planes, automobiles. Non-conventional warfare, we're talking about intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear warheads. So everything is increasing during these time periods as the two countries stand off against each other. So new departments and military bases had to be built, not just in the United States. I mean, we were building military bases overseas. In fact, one of the primary controversies during the Cold War Cuban Missile Crisis was the fact that the United States had military bases in Turkey, and those military bases had nuclear weapons on them facing Moscow and other Russian cities, and they were literally right across the sea from being able to hit them. So it would have taken just a matter of minutes. And that had been a primary concern for the Russians. So we see that the national defense budget is being increased, and we see all of this military spending taking place. But at the same time, if you notice in the 30s, we have the development of the welfare state, which is still around. So we have this domestic spending, and we have military spending taking place, and both are attempting to increase at the same time. So you can imagine how much money was being pushed into the economy to allow this to happen. So we see all of this military bases on American and foreign soil. Now, when you look at the military spending, so U.S. military spending in blue, so you can see, look at that 1950s into the 60s, you see that increase, significant increase in U.S. spending. You'll notice there in the 1990s that deficits rose above spending. So we see just how much we're spending, how much the importance of the military was during that Cold War time period. Now, our third factor here is the move to fiat money. August of 1971, I was actually August 15th, you want to be exact, 1971, U.S. comes off the gold standard. So this was a decision by the Nixon administration. In doing so, of course, we moved away from representative money within the economy representing gold to basically Nixon's administration and future administrations could encourage the Fed to increase the money supply, or they could simply just print new money because now it was backed by the strength of the government and the strength of the economy. So inflation rates rise considerably. So when you look at it there, you can pretty clearly see that 1972 to 74, 75, that significant increase in the inflation rate, printing money. So price levels were increasing steadily during that time period. So when you look at CPI, you'll notice there's a it's not steep obviously, but it's a very steady rise in price levels over time. And that's because of these consistent influx of money into the economy with us being removed from the gold standard. So when you look here, this is give you a better idea. So if you look at spending for the government and then for the median, which is the average more or less, the household income, so you'll see that from 1970 to 2010, there was a 24.2% rise in median household income. Total spending, though, for the federal government rose 287.5%. So from 1970 to 2010, federal spending increased by 287.5%. That should tell you something about where this money was going and what was happening as the government was spending and government was expanding. So when you look at the size of the government in the 1920s compared to the size of the government in the 1930s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and to today, it's a significant increase. And not just on a federal level, but state increase, local level. We see government is just so much bigger, which means it costs so much more money to run. It costs so much more money to be able to pay for all of these employees and everything that's taking place. So obviously we saw that there was a significant increase in federal spending. We know there was an increase in state spending as well, because one of the things that the New Deal alone did was that it took money that it was creating and it pushed it into the states and said, here's these programs, now you're going to actually run those programs, which means the state had to create departments and hire employees to be able to actually run the programs that the federal government was paying them to run. So like federal spending, since the 1970s, state spending has also increased significantly. One of the reasons for this is the beginning of the 1970s, the federal government began increasing Medicaid spending. So reduced spending on public works projects, which then the states had to pay for. So here's what the government did. Government took a portion of that money from its budget and pushed it into Medicaid. It then said, okay, these public works projects have to be built. But then the states were the ones responsible for actually building the products. So it would be like if the federal government mandated, we want to do this. For example, the federal government said, listen, we want to mandate a national speed limit. Guess who has to enforce that speed limit? Guess who pays for all those speed limit signs? It's the states themselves that are going out and putting these signs up. They're hiring officers to enforce this. They've got court costs on, and all these other costs in terms of just dealing with that one issue. So you have all of this stuff that's taking place that's increasing state spending. So public works projects are publicly used facilities and roads that are built and maintained by the government using tax dollars. So we see these different things. So you get the idea here when you look at state spending, you can see how much it's increased. We're talking about from being under that 5 billion mark to being up over 20 billion. So we're talking about a very large increase in spending. This chart here, we'll look at government employment. Notice that the most significant increase in employment for governments is in the local level. But you also notice, of course, that the state has risen. And then, of course, you'll notice the federal government itself has spikes in employment, but for the most part, you'll see that it's a fairly steady. By the way, those spikes themselves, those are census years. So that's when they hire more employees to go and do census, take that census data and pick that up. So we see that the government has gotten big, but in particular, local governments have grown significantly, which should tell you about the increased importance of local governments within the American, not only the government system itself, but also in the economic system. The next thing we'll look at here is this transfer of funds to state and local governments. So when you look at this, this is from 2008. So here's the amount of money being transferred from funds being transferred to state and local governments from the national government. So this is federal aid. And this is how they do things. Okay, we want you to, this is what we want to do, but you're going to actually have to maintain it. And the biggest, of course, is this Medicaid and healthcare. And essentially what's happened is all the money comes in from taxes. That's then budgeted out. A portion of that budget goes to Medicaid and healthcare, obviously. It's a pretty significant portion. But those programs themselves are actually administered by the states, but they're paid for by the federal government. So you can see here agriculture, education, other different agencies, housing, transportation. So you see where all of this money, and it's not a small amount, we're talking about huge amounts of money that are being transferred from the national government to state and local governments, who are then having to spend money themselves to be able to actually administer these programs. Now, of course, the most significant, most notable here is this increased medical spending. So you can look here in 1987, 68% of private businesses, that's the share of health expenditures. So they paid for 68%, whereas the government only paid for 32%. But you look at by 2010, now you see that increase where the federal government is now paying 45% of healthcare expenses, whereas corporations, businesses, households were paying 55%. Now, we see that's a huge change. That's a significant difference, because we're talking about a 13% increase in what government is spending on medical care. That number, of course, increases over time, because what's happening to the American population, obviously, is it's aging. So when you look here, by 2032, there will be more old people than children. That's common in advanced economies, because what happens is as people's education levels go up, the number of kids they have declines, and so what you see is an older aging population. But you get a really, really good idea there, and you'll notice when you're looking at it, that total population, you see there that you see below 15%, then you, well, 15, age of 15, then you see that 15 to 64 age group, and then you see that 65 plus. What's significant, of course, is there are going to be more people in the 65 plus range than there are people below the age of 15. That gives you an idea how much healthcare spending is going to cost as we continue to advance into the future. So what about the national debt? And you look at this here. So the red line in the middle there, so that's average revenue. You can see that. Now, when you look at the blue line, that's spending. So you see there's a significant gap between spending and revenue. In other words, the total revenue minus total cost equals a negative in profit if you look at this from a business perspective. So in other words, the government itself is not sustaining itself. What happens is it's creating debt. So national debt is being created in order for our government to actually function. So they function in a constant state of negative influx of money. They're spending far, far more than they're taking in. And you can see where that's at. Notice that Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, those three programs alone, we spend more on those three programs alone than we do actually bringing in tax dollars. Then you see defense, all other spending, and then net interest, which the net interest, of course, is becoming larger and larger and larger because the debt becomes bigger than the interest that we pay on that debt becomes larger and larger. And that's what's pretty significant here, is that the two primary things that we spend money on are healthcare and paying interest on a national debt that continues to increase in significant amounts. And so right on time here, our federal spending. So you'll see the revenue at 2.52 trillion, where spending is at 3.6 trillion in 2010. Notice, of course, that you saw right there at the end of the 1990s, in the early part of 2000s, right there where Clinton was president and transitioning into George Bush Jr., you saw that the revenue actually was above spending. The government was actually making money. But since then, of course, it's declined, and that decline has only gotten sharper because look what happened when we had that recession right around 2008, 2009. We saw a massive increase in spending. We saw a significant drop in revenue. And in other words, a $1.08 trillion deficit was estimated for the year 2012. That only has grown. So think about that. We're talking $1 trillion difference between how much we spend versus how much we actually bring in. So if the government really wanted to balance the budget, they would either do one of two things. They'd either cut massive amounts of programs, or they would have to raise taxes highly. They would have a significant increase, and neither one of those is ever going to happen. So you would have to do some form of both, but people don't want to pay higher taxes, and the government doesn't want to reduce health care because people aren't going to stand for that either. So that deficit just continues to increase over time. So let's look at the function of government. So since the government has grown and continues to grow, what then is its function? Now, we want to look on a basic level, the government functions from an economic standpoint. We're not going to focus on everything that's non-economic, and we're not going to get into huge details. We just want to look at the basic level. What's the responsibility that the government has from an economics standpoint in our country? They need to protect individual rights, in particular property rights. Property rights are crucial. They are an absolute must in order to have a market economy. Without property rights, you are not going to be able to generate financial capital and the desire of individuals to invest in the economy, entrepreneurs. You want to promote a stable environment for economic activity. So that may mean interacting in markets in which there's market failure. That's the use of price floors and price ceilings. Also within this would be to create equality and create a fair playing field for both consumers and producers. I want to promote the general well-being of its citizens. And by general well-being, we're talking about standard of living. If you're able to increase the standard of living of the citizens, then that allows them more money to be able to spend within the economy, and thus makes that economy run. But if people are just too poor to spend, well, we've got all kinds of problems taking place. So one of the functions here is to ensure that all citizens, not just the rich, but that all citizens see an increase in well-being. But how do they do this? because it sounds well and great, but it's not as easy as you might think. So there's this major question we have to talk about in terms of how the government is actually going to manage and actually perform these functions. So the first thing we're going to talk about from what the government is doing is providing public goods. So remember, public goods are those which are available to all, whether they pay or not. The classic example that you're used to, of course, is welfare, because people on welfare don't pay into welfare, because that wouldn't make sense. If they can pay into welfare, they probably don't need to be on welfare so much. So you look at welfare and think, okay, we have all of these people that are paying in, but not everyone is using it, of course. The people who use it are people who need it, who probably aren't paying into the system to begin with. There's no marginal cost associated with providing public goods. And the reason the government provides public goods is because there's no price attached to them. Thus, a normal market can't function. How do you put a price on a fireworks show that anybody can see from anywhere? Because it's not like you can say we're just going to put up a giant border so that nobody can see anything other than the people that are watching the fireworks directly. It's anybody could view it. So from that perspective, you can't put a market value or a price on public goods. Therefore, there's no way to create a supply and demand. No buyer is going to be willing to buy at a certain price because they may just get it lower. No seller is going to produce because they don't know what to produce at what price, because there's no set price. So the government must provide them, because market failure will occur when resources cannot be allocated efficiently. The other aspect here is protecting property rights. So this is done so that economic activity can occur legally and prosperously. By protecting property rights, you're ensuring that people are able to legally maintain control and value of their goods. They can do what they want with their stuff from within a legal perspective, but also that they can prosper, because over time, for a large part of history in a lot of places, property, ownership of property represented citizenship, represented power. So by protecting that right to own property, and it doesn't mean just like literally land, but we're talking about some sort of economic value that you have hold of, that creates the ability for you to be active within the economy, for you to prosper. Remember that the ability to control the factors of production is a key to entrepreneurial risk and reward, and that's exactly what we're talking about, is your ability to control the factors of production. And then we see the development of what we call merit goods. So the government will also fund the deployment of merit goods, and these are goods and services that have a socially redeemable function about them. So when you see that there's this is typically a service issue, when there's a socially redeemable function about them, this service, then the government will provide for the development of that service. And then that service, of course, benefits all individuals. So demerit goods. These are goods that are socially undesirable. You can think about these like alcohol, cigarettes, things of this, marijuana. The government seeks to reduce their use in society. Demerit goods are negative externalities. This is a term we used at the first of the course. And it's a consumption activity that creates an external cost to a bystander. So if something you do is causing a bystander to have to pay for it, then that's possibility that it could be, of course, a negative externality, that it's socially undesirable. Secondhand smoke is probably the best example of this. If you're in a crowded room full of people and one person lights up a cigarette, they're not just affecting themselves, but they're affecting everyone around them as well who has not chosen to participate in the activity. So it creates a larger quantity of health risks than are deemed socially desirable. And that's really the thing here, is that one of the reasons why governments have banned smoking cigarettes in airplanes, and then a lot of local governments have banned the smoking of cigarettes within restaurants, is because they're trying to move people who are smoking away from those who aren't, and thus reduce the health risk. Now, taxes are used to reduce the negative externality. So if you want to reduce the consumption of socially undesirable goods amongst individuals, then you can tax it. It's interesting that we tax cigarettes and we tax alcohol, but marijuana is actually illegal. Now, if you were to legalize marijuana, theoretically speaking, you could put a tax on it and possibly reduce its consumption. I mean, that's just what some of the arguments are in concern to it. Now, an individual, Arthur Pigou, he was an economist. He suggested what we call Pigovian taxes, and these are used to correct the effects of negative externalities. In other words, he believed that the single best way to reduce negative externalities was to tax them. In other words, to make someone pay in order to participate within the activity. So sometimes you see the term sin tax, particularly here in the South, that's used to describe this, in particular with alcohol and cigarettes. So the tax internalizes the externality by taxing the activity that causes it. So it would be as if saying, okay, if you want to smoke, you're going to have to pay more money for your cigarettes. In other words, in order for you to participate in the activity, it's going to cost you a greater amount of your income. Well, think about the law of demand. When the price of goods rises, the consumption of said good decreases. So that's what they're trying to do. The problem with something like cigarettes is since they're addictive, people will still pay the higher prices even though they go up and use a greater portion of their income because they can't stop. So if you want to smoke, you can, but the tax on cigarettes will be higher than the tax on other goods. That's why you see some gas stations that will say the lowest prices in the state. The reality is all of them are paying, you've got your base price and then you have the tax that's built on top of that. And that tax is not a sales tax of 9.75%. It's much, much higher. So increasing the price of cigarettes drives down the demand for them. So Bakovian taxes are preferred to government regulations because they're a lower cost to society. Think about the two ideas here. The government can either tax you for consumption of good or they can try to regulate you. Well, if they try to regulate you, well, now they have to pay individuals to do the regulating. So it creates an incentive to smoke less, thus creating a greater reduction in the negative externality. So in order to reduce the negative externality, basically you create the incentive of smoking less because you'll have more money. Okay, the next function of government is to promote the general welfare. And there's been a concerted effort to increase the overall standard of living within this country and reduce the poverty rate. This has been something that's going on for the last century as the government has made efforts to try to increase the overall standard of living and reduce the poverty rate. And of course, these two go hand in hand because if you increase the standard of living amongst your overall population, you're automatically reducing the poverty rate. Now, three methods are used to promote the general welfare that we've talked about: minimum wages, social insurance programs, and public assistance programs. We've already studied these in detail as to how they're designed to try to promote the general welfare. How effective have those attempts been, though? So when we look at this real GDP per capita, what we'll notice, of course, is that we look all the way back there at 1929, and then we go into 1932 and notice that the average per capita income in 1932 was about $5,000. Then you look up here towards the end, to 2007, 2008, 2010, you'll notice that it is at about 44, 43 in 2010. What's interesting, of course, though, is if you look at that and then you look back before 2008, in other words, the economy in 2010, 2011 was just beginning to recover from where it had been, almost 7 or 8 years before. So how much has it cost? Will it continue to cost? That's one of the big questions here is, how much have we spent on promoting the general welfare and how much will we have to continue spending to do so? So real GDP per capita in the long run has trended upward. So that's what we're seeing is we're seeing this upward trend, which would suggest that, of course, in the short run, we see fluctuations like we did in 2008, 2009. So while incomes in 2011 were the same as they were in 1995, though. So think about that for a second. Incomes in 2011 were the same as they were in 1995. Okay. The trend would suggest that they rise above that, though. So if you look at the long-term trend line, you get the idea and you say, okay, from a trending perspective, individuals will make more money in 10 years than they are making right now. Well, that's fine and dandy, of course, but you got to remember how much of prices increased during that time as well. Because remember that just because there's a minimum wage or a wage of some sort, that doesn't necessarily suggest that it's a standard of living wage. Okay, so let's look at U.S. income distribution. So here's our lowest fifth. And we've looked at this before. They started under $10,000, this is average income, to basically $20,000, 2011. Now, of course, remember now, this is the development of both prices and production within the economy. So this is looking at what is causing the increase. So here we see the next one, where they're at. So our lowest fifth and our second fifth, these are, of course, our lowest earners. These, of course, are our lowest educated as well. But there is a little bit of a gap that, of course, has emerged between the lowest fifth and that second fifth. Then we look at that third. So when we look at that third fifth, this is the average middle income family. And you'll notice that their income here is it's about $54,000 for that average median income. But there's a significant difference between the third and the lowest quintile. There's a significant difference between the second and third. And then you pull out the fourth, and you'll notice that gap begins to widen. So what happens, of course, is as you increase your education levels, you'll see that you're able to increase your financial capital and how much money you're making and increase your standard of living as an individual. But what's significant here is we see that real increases in incomes are occurring in the top 95th percentile of the nation with very little change occurring at the bottom. That's significant. The majority of change within our income is happening at the top, not at the bottom, which hasn't seen a huge amount of change. So literally, are people better off today than they were back in the past? Has the standard of living actually increased for all or just a few? Well, when we talk about increases in per capita GDP, everyone's increased a little bit, but most of the increasements have taken in that fifth and that fourth quintile there. The overwhelming majority of it has. Very little of that growth has actually taken place at the bottom ends of this. So when you look at the real GDP per capita and you see how it's growing, it kind of almost looks like that fifth quintile there more than anything, because that's where you see the most growth. You're not seeing a very much growth at all among the lowest and the second quintiles within this country. So that standard of living has increased, but the gap, the economic inequality has increased steadily during that time as well. And that brings us right into our next point of here, income inequality and the general welfare. So the growing gap between the haves and have-nots continues to be an issue because you can look at it on a piece of paper and see it. It's right there. And even though the government has attempted to promote the general welfare, the gap has not closed. In other words, the government should be doing more to reduce that gap. Well, how do you reduce that gap is the problem. And the single biggest reason and the biggest argument takes place is that literally when we start talking about political philosophies, if you're on one side that says, look, why don't we just start taking all this money from the rich, increase their taxes, and then redistribute that out to the poor? Then you've got another side that says we don't need to do income redistribution. What these people need to do is just find better jobs. So we see this significant difference in economic thought processes. So that gap isn't just being closed, it's actually increasing. So this brings up the question of, is the standard of living in the United States actually improving? Well, it depends on what quintile you're in is the answer. So another thing the government's responsible for is income redistribution. So how do we create something to close the gap in income inequality? Well, we do it through income redistribution. So if we studied this already and looked at how this takes place and looked at, philosophically speaking, how income redistribution is thought. And so remember that the concept is based on taking tax revenue and then using it to subsidize assistance programs, such as social insurance programs and public welfare programs. Now, are those programs needed? That's one question. Question two would be, are they effective? Well, are they needed? Yes. Are they effective? Not necessarily. Okay, so the last function of government here is to promote economic stability. So the government exists in part to ensure the economy does not collapse. Market failures do occur, but the government attempts to reduce the negative externalities that exist within failing markets. Remember we talked about this whole difference between efficiency. So sometimes we see market failure, government's going to intervene and attempt to create greater equality. Now, of course, they'll do so, at the expense of efficiency, but it's all about trying to create some sort of fairness and some sort of equality within the market sometimes. Now, at the same time, they'll try to promote positive externalities. So you may create inefficiency in an effort to create some sort of positive good. For example, when you talk about education externalities, if you think about it from a purely standpoint of we want to get the smartest kids we can, should everyone be in school? The answer to that may not be no. But every single person is required to go to school and attend school, even though, of course, that reduces the efficiency of the classroom. But the positive benefit of getting everyone education is that it allows them to then, of course, work in more skilled jobs and thus get access to a higher standard of living. The problem is just getting everybody to understand, hey, the reason you're being educated is to improve your standard of living in the long run, because people just think in that short right here, right now, and then they don't care. But then when they get older, they're like, oh, I can't find a job. So that education externality and promoting that positive externality is an important part. Now, when we talk about promoting economic stability, we're probably talking about basically four primary things here. One is to regulate negative externalities, using whether Pigovian taxes or regulations themselves in an effort to try to prevent negative aspects. To promote competition. So government uses antitrust laws, and these laws prevent firms from barring entry into the market of other firms. So you can't prevent somebody from entering a market in unless you're the government. Then you can prevent football teams from just being created and playing in the NFL because they're exempt from antitrust laws. Well, supervise management labor relations. So the National Labor Relations Board supervises relations between firms and unions in order to try to find a fair but also fast contract between the two. Consumer protection. So consumer protection laws, several agencies and advocacy groups work to protect consumers from firms engaging in bad business practices such as fraud. There's a reason why you have labels on all of the goods nowadays. It's because in the past, at the turn of the century, firms were just putting all kinds of stuff into products and you didn't know what it was. If you've ever read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and reread the parts on the sausage and the candy, you get a good idea real quick why that label says, hey, here's what's in this product. So we've looked at the growth and the functions of government. The next is to look at taxation, how taxation works, where that money is going, how it's being collected. These are important parts of our economic system.